But today we're going to just continue right along as we have been all summer. We've been looking at the book of Exodus, and we are following the Hebrew people through the wilderness. They are going towards the promised land, and we're just continuing to see. We've seen them complain for lack of food and water. We've seen Moses have a visit from Jethro, his father-in-law, who gave him a good idea about how to delegate. And now they are arriving at Mount Sinai. This is a special mountain. Now, they have been in the wilderness for 3 months at this point, so still very early in their journey, which is going to be 40 years. And so they're still just beginning. And they get to Mount Sinai, and this is an important mountain for Moses because this is where he had his first encounter with God in the burning bush, who called him to return to Egypt to start this whole project. And so this probably, no doubt, was meaningful for Moses to come back to the place where it all began, so to speak. And so all the people gather around Mount Sinai. They're going to stay here for a long time. They stay here, I think, longer than anywhere else that they camp in the wilderness. And this is where we have the giving of the law. Moses acts as a mediator between God, the rest of the people, and God. Now, at first, it seems to display the idea that all the people would be able to go up the mountain, but then eventually the people decide that's not best, and God decides that's probably not best either. And I don't think it's because God is necessarily an introvert, but I think that God, well, there's this belief in that time that it was dangerous to get too close to God. I mean, you could literally die if you get in too close a proximity with God or see God. Most people in the Bible who saw God did not feel blessed. They felt scared for their lives. And so the people, even though they weren't going to go up the mountain, they consecrated themselves, they washed their clothes, they did things to get ready to be able to go up to the base of the mountain. There's a boundary they were not to cross, otherwise they could die. So a very different way about thinking about the presence of God than we have today. But Moses was going to go up the mountain to receive the law. Now, God comes and he descends down to the summit of the mountain, and we are reminded that in most ancient Near Eastern religions of the day, it was believed that gods would come down onto the mountaintops, as mountains were the highest structures that they had in those days. And so God comes down, and there is just a bunch of images. They use imagery to describe this, like storm imagery, thunder, lightning, dark clouds, as God descends down onto this mountain. Again, a common imagery amongst especially Canaanite religions, where there'd be this storm imagery. Baal is the storm god, and so you have similar imagery. God comes down on the mountain. Moses goes up. In fact, Moses will go up this mountain a total of 4 times in this whole endeavor. I hope he had his pedometer on, because he's going to get some real good steps. So he goes up and down this mountain 4 different times and receives the law, I guess, in different chunks. So we don't have all of the law in our scriptures today. And by the way, we're covering a lot of ground because we're covering chapters 19 to 24. Now, that's not all of the law. The law is scattered throughout Leviticus and Deuteronomy, maybe some in Numbers. And so we see the law scattered about. But it is massive, over 600 commands. Now, that being said, some of the laws and commands in the Bible are different versions of laws in Exodus, written in a different way, written for a different time, because the law was given to a nomadic people who moved from place to place. And so when they settled and formed their kingdom and had kings, they had to adapt the laws for their new situation. So we'll see some differences when we read them earlier on versus later on in the Old Testament, and that's to be expected. But this is a massive law. Now, for our part, we are looking at the 10 Commandments and the Book of the Covenant is what it's called. The 10 Commandments we're pretty familiar with, and the Book of the Covenant, that would be the other laws besides the 10 Commandments that are in Exodus. So let's take a brief look at some of these laws. Now, the 10 Commandments you're pretty familiar with. As it said, these are the ones that are on the stone tablets and we'll get into those tablets in a future sermon. But the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me, which, as I mentioned a few weeks back, that doesn't necessarily mean what we think it does. It's not explicitly saying that there are no other gods beside me. It's saying you shall have no other gods before me. In other words, you shall worship me exclusively. And so this is not, God, I kind of tend to view it that God did not want to blow their minds by saying, hey, you know all these other gods that are everywhere? They're not real. I'm the only one. That was more of a radical idea at that point than we can think of because we're so used to that idea. But God oftentimes would teach them things gradually. And so I think that instead of telling them that he's the only God, that what he was saying is, I don't want you to worship all these other gods. I don't want you to worship them. I just want you to worship me. And later on, they would come to the realization that their God is the only God. But that's why it says, you shall have no other gods before me. Number 2 is that they should not have any graven images or idols, which made them unique amongst the religions. Most religions were characterized by statues and idols and things like that. So they were to have no idols of their God. Number 3, they were not to use God's name in vain, which we sometimes misinterpret this command to say no swearing. Yes and no. It's not really talking about every curse word that we have in the English language. That is mentioned in the New Testament and elsewhere where it talks about not using coarse language, but swear words in general is not what the third commandment is concerned about. It's concerned with not using God's name lightly, like saying, giving some kind of a thoughtless oath, which many people in the Bible did, and trying to swear by God that they will do such and such or won't do such and such. People will, anytime you use God's name lightly. So the phrase is, oh my God, or the abbreviation OMG, is actually for religious, the more religious you are, that's actually the most offensive curse word than any of the other curse words that we have. Generally, we think it's the other way around. We think that that's one of the more mild ones. But according to the scriptures, this is the only one that actually breaks a commandment. So just something to think about. So we have the not using God's name in vain, and then we also have keeping the Sabbath day, keeping it holy, which for the Jewish people was Saturday. We had the audacity to move it to Sundays. And so really what this means for us is that we want to keep a day holy, we want to rest, we want to focus on God during that day. And then honor your parents, which they may have had in mind mostly when you're an adult taking care of your elderly parents, although it certainly applies for minors as well with their parents. Then we have do not kill anyone, do not commit adultery, do not steal, and then we have do not bear false witness in court. And then finally, the last one is do not covet. Do not desire some other people's possessions. And so they list the things. The list is interesting. Do not desire your neighbor's house or wife or animals or slaves. Isn't that interesting that slaves and women are lumped in together with animals and house? So first of all, it doesn't mention the husband. This is told from a male point of view. Even the 10 Commandments are told from a male point of view. And this is a time period in which only men really were viewed as being full persons. And so, if we were to do this today, we might update that a little bit. But we know what they're talking about. So we understand the idea that's coming across here. And so those are the 10 Commandments. Like I said, we're pretty familiar with them. But let's take a brief look, a bird's eye view of the Book of the Covenant, the other laws in this section. So we're going to take a look at the good and the bad and the ugly. And there's some of everything in the laws. For instance, the law regulates slavery so that, it was not that uncommon in those days that if you had a debt that you couldn't pay, you would become a slave to pay off your debt. So the law stated that after 7 years, Hebrew slaves were to go free. Now, if you were a foreigner, all bets are off as far as that goes. But if you're a Hebrew, you're to go free after 7 years. However, if you acquire a wife and children during those 7 years of slavery, if you want to stay with your family, you need to remain a slave for the rest of your life. You can go free, but if you're going to go free, you're going to have to leave your wife and children behind. So it also talks about other things. For instance, what if a father wants to sell his daughter into slavery? Well, if a father wants to sell his daughter into slavery, then the law states that the person that he sells the daughter to cannot sell her again to somebody else. So it's meant to protect the woman in some sense, and yet we want to scream, how about the father doesn't sell his daughter into slavery? How about we just abolish slavery instead? Isn't that a good idea? And so that's disturbing to us. It regulates violence in slavery. So if you beat your slave and your slave is unconscious, if they get up in a day or two, it's okay. No harm. No punishment. After all, they are your property. It literally says that. So it regulates slavery, which is kind of disconcerting to us. It helps explore such universal experiences, such as what do you do if your ox gores someone to death? What do you do? Well, it depends. Does your ox, is it known to be violent, or is it a mostly peaceful ox? Your punishment might be different. What do you do if somebody steals your sheep? Who of us hasn't experienced that a time or two? It talks about the death penalty, and it kind of throws the death penalty around liberally. Watch out if you curse your parents, or if you sacrifice to another god, which sacrifice was how they worship. So if you worship another god besides Yahweh, you're to be killed. And we think the Muslims are violent. We look at our own scriptures and we see that our scriptures have some violence in there as well. So that's some of the ugly. We would call that the ugly in the Book of the Covenant. But that's not all that there is. There are other things as well. There are good things, as we see. Sometimes we can see the intention behind even the ugly ones. But there are some better laws as well to talk about the goodness of God, about how God cares about the alien in their midst, that the alien or the undocumented immigrant in their midst, that they are to treat them with love and care because they were once aliens in Egypt. The caring for the poor, caring for those that are unfortunate. There's a law about how you are to farm the land for 6 years, and then the 7th year you are to give the land rest and not farm it. Can you believe that? There's not evidence that that was ever actually practiced, but it's an interesting idea. And they said that the poor can eat off the food that ends up growing on that land, even though it's not farmed. It talks about annual festivals that the Jews would celebrate throughout the year, and then it is concluded with a ceremony where they ratify the covenant with God and say, we will follow this. But of course, as I said, that's not the end. There are more laws in other books. So, the obvious question that we want to ask is, do we follow this law today? The law of Moses, the law of the Old Testament, the law given by God, do we follow this law? Is it meant for us today, or how are we to read this? How are we to interpret this? Because many times we assume that the law of the Old Testament is universally applicable to all people at all times. And yet oftentimes, if we read the Bible, we skim or skip the parts of the law. But if we look at it closely, we will see that it was never presented as something that would be universally applicable to all of humanity. We see that obviously many parts of the law are specifically for an agricultural nomadic people. As we talked about oxes, sheep, there's a lot more, there are many more laws that have to do with that. And so that applies to some people today, but not everyone. And so, we live in a different context, and rules have to sometimes be adapted while keeping the principles that are in there. So this was never presented as being universally applicable. It was not presented as something that everybody needs to follow verbatim. This was a specific covenant, a specific agreement given between God and the Hebrew people as they are going to the Promised Land and then beyond. But these laws are not to be followed by us verbatim. We get this teaching from Jesus, from Paul in the New Testament, that these are not to be followed verbatim. So for instance, it doesn't mean we throw them out either. But for instance, we are meant to go beyond them. So that's why we followed the Holy Spirit and abolished slavery, right? Not completely. Slavery exists in many forms today. But we abolished many forms of slavery, even though the law regulates it and never condemns it. You know, there are plenty of sermons. If you Googled it, I bet you could find some sermons from preachers in the southern states during the Civil War era. And they had plenty of scriptures to talk about the godly institution of slavery. And that's because there were plenty of scriptures that supported it and none that condemned it. And so what we have done after Jesus is that we have followed the Holy Spirit to take some of the intent of those laws and bring them to fulfillment by saying slavery in general is evil and we're going to abolish it. There's a law in the Bible that if a man rapes a woman, that he is to marry her. Okay, well, you know, maybe we can see the intent of that in the time in a patriarchal society where if a woman is raped, nobody else is going to want to marry her. And so therefore, if she is going to be secure in life, the person who did that should marry her, according to their thinking. But we can say, how about instead we view women as full persons, and we say that instead of the rapist marrying the woman, rapist goes to jail. Okay? So we follow the Holy Spirit, and we continue in the direction beyond the laws, but we go in the spirit of the law, and we fulfill the law as we see a more Christ-like way. So there are many things that are biblical that are not Christ-like. There are many things that are biblical that we should not do. In fact, if we followed all the laws of the Old Testament verbatim, there's a very good chance that we might end up in jail. And so we want to be really careful about that. So who gives us the freedom to do this? Who gives us the freedom to stretch and to go beyond the law and to either change its meaning or completely not follow it? Jesus Christ. None other than Jesus, the greatest representation of God that we have ever seen, greater than any representation of God that even Moses saw, greater than any image of God that the prophets saw. They saw some. They saw some of God. Moses definitely saw a lot of God compared to anyone else in that day. But even Moses did not see God as clearly as those who knew Jesus Christ. That's why in the New Testament, I think it's in the book of Hebrews, they talk often about how Moses was good, Jesus is greater. And that's why some of the laws of Moses reflect the heart of Christ, and some of them maybe less so. And that's why is that Moses saw God, but he saw dimly. Jesus is the clear picture of God, or at least the clearest picture of God that we have seen. And so Jesus gives us permission in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've heard that it was said, and then he would quote Old Testament law, and then he'll say, but I say to you, and he will give it a different interpretation, or he will fulfill it. So we follow the law of Christ, not the law of Moses. But it's a little more complicated. It doesn't mean we just throw that away. But you say, well, what is the law of Christ? Well, the law of Christ isn't spelled out quite as extensively as the law in the Old Testament, but you can look at the Sermon on the Mount for sure. Matthew chapters 5 through 7, you can look at that. And that has things like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, do not seek revenge, things like that. The Sermon on the Mount is the closest thing you'll get to a full explanation of the law of Christ. And they're really more principles than anything that we can apply then to our lives. The Apostle Paul preached against following the law verbatim, especially for non-Jewish Christians, as that's all he argued about. If you read his letters, that's all he argued about. And so he understood that the law, the Old Testament law, because you might be wondering, well, what is the point of it then? Well, the Old Testament law was pointing towards Jesus. The Old Testament law was a way of living for a period of time, but it was pointing ahead towards Jesus. And so, Jesus was not intending to throw out the law. Paul was not intending to throw out the law. Remember, they were Jews through and through, 100%, birth to death. They were Jews. They were never anything else other than Jews. They never became Christians. Christianity was a religion that formed a few hundred years after Jesus, but before it was just a different form of Judaism. They were Jews through and through, so we have to remember that. They never threw out the law. They thought that the law was important, and not just as a historical relic, even though it does help us to see how people view God at different times, but the law is something that Jesus came to fulfill, not to throw away. And so the intent of the law, the spirit of the law, continues and is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so, we have permission from God to think for ourselves as we follow the law of Christ, sometimes beyond the law of the Old Testament, but yet we use the law of the Old Testament as our starting ground. And in fact, once we know the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, then we can go back to the Old Testament law and we can see the parts and the intentions that are more Christ-like. And then we can see some stuff that, maybe we will just kind of leave that alone. Such as a father selling their daughter into slavery. Maybe we'll just leave that part alone and say that's not really Christ-like, and so we're not going to follow that. But we can take the principle of caring for people who are vulnerable in society and making sure that they are well cared for, and we can do that in our own lives. So, it's interesting that in different times in history, Christians have gotten all up in arms about posting the Ten Commandments in courthouses and public spaces, and yet I've never heard a Christian talk about posting the Sermon on the Mount, the law of Christ, in public spaces. That's interesting. So, the question that we have to ask is, following the law of Christ, how do we know if we're going out of bounds? Because this is a little bit different way of thinking about it. For many of us, we might be used to the idea that for everything in life there is a verse. There's a verse that we go to, and therefore that makes it so we don't have to necessarily have to come up with our own solutions, that we can go to a verse. But if the law of Christ is saying that we have a lot of freedom in many ways to use the wonderful complex brains that God has given us, then how do we know when we're going out of bounds or straying too far away from Christ? And I like the image of an astronaut going on a spacewalk. You know what a spacewalk is? It's when astronauts go outside of their space station, spacecraft, and they're either working outside on something or they're floating in space, but they have to remain tethered to that space station. Otherwise, if they're not somehow tethered to that space station, they're going to just go floating off into empty space, and it might be certain death. And that's how I like to view us following the law of Christ. We have a lot of freedom in the law of Christ. Paul mentions that. We have a lot of freedom in the law of Christ. But nonetheless, we must remain tethered to Christ. We must remain tethered to Jesus. That means understanding what he taught, understanding what he did, being familiar with things like the Sermon on the Mount and the other stories in the Gospels. And then when we remain tethered to Christ, we can also look at the other parts of the Bible, of course, too, including the law of Moses that he received on Mount Sinai, but we remain tethered to Christ. So if we're trying to remain tethered to Christ, and then we look at the Old Testament law, and we see that they cared for undocumented immigrants, they cared for the poor, or how they cared for women in a very different society than our own, and we can take some of those principles and apply them, we are remaining tethered to Christ. But if we take an Old Testament law that says like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and we say, well, I'm going to follow that because that's what the law says, is that I can seek revenge on somebody who does something against me, our tether is broken. You see, and we're floating off into empty space because we're no longer tethered to Christ. Instead, we're following something else. We're following the law of somebody who did not see God as clearly as those who knew Jesus. And so we break off that tether. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to break off that tether. So that tether gives us a lot of freedom to move around. But if we start to move away from the law of Christ, that tether is broken. And we might go floating off and go way too far. So we want to remain tethered to Christ. And then, if we are tethered to Christ, then we will be able to look at things like the Old Testament law. And we will be able to see God in there, because God is in there. You know, there's a lot in the Old Testament law talking about the love and compassion of God, the care that God has for those who are vulnerable in society. There are many things, even intentions in some of the ugly laws, that we can maybe see some of the intentions that they were working towards. And we can take from that law what is good and Christ-like. And of course, the Ten Commandments, pretty much all of them, are good and Christ-like, right? Those are the basics, right? But even the Book of the Covenant, we can take the law and we can say, okay, I see the Christ-likeness in here. But then I can see that if I follow some things in here, I'm going to be breaking my tether. And so we want to remain tethered to Christ. And when we remain tethered to Him and follow the law of Christ, then we will continue to be a blessing to the world. And we will continue to share God's love with those who need it most. Amen.